Okay, in this video we're going to go through a review of level 3 behavior and the final level, results. We'll be looking at these two levels together, and as you recall, evaluating them can be challenging. So to start off with, when we look at measuring behavior, we're talking about what learning took place in the training environment that actually gets moved into real action. It gets converted into activities. The behavior is measured by exhibiting use of the knowledge. Sometimes this can happen in the classroom setting when necessary, when it may be too impractical or too dangerous to evaluate behaviors in a real setting. But oftentimes we're looking at in the workplace or in the next place where that learning is being applied. So we want to actually measure the behavior in the setting where it's being used. Specifically, we want to evaluate behavior to try to find out how much of it is related directly to the training that the student went through, and how much of it may not be related to that. We want to measure how much change in behavior has actually happened. And with those two measures, we can actually tell a better story about the learning environment with the investment that's been made in training, and we can talk about how much this training has transferred into practical use. So there are 4 conditions identified for change to occur. Kirkpatrick talks about these 4 items being necessary for change to happen at all. First of all, there's got to be a desire to change on the part of the student. There's got to be knowledge of what to do and how to do it. So you have to know what you need to do. There has to be the right climate or culture or attitudes around the individual so that change can happen. And lastly, there needs to be a reward for positive change. I know that some of you have often talked about incentives as an important piece, but I just want to remind you that incentives here are the reward for positive change, and that is just one of the conditions for change to happen. So keep that in the right frame of mind. In terms of types of climate, there can be several different types. There's the type of climate where things are completely neutral. There can be the type of climate where there's positive support for change, whether it's because it's an encouraging climate or a requirement of the climate that someone is in. And then there can be negative climates as well, where there's preventing people from changing, and there's also discouraging either attitudes or activities that discourage people from making change. When you are a trainer, it's helpful to know what the environment is that you're training in. And that can be a formal environment and an informal cultural context. So back to those rewards. There are 2 types of rewards that we talk about here. There are intrinsic rewards that are self-provided. This is motivation from the student, internally provided motivation from the student to themselves. This can be anything from interest in the topics to sort of the motivation to complete it. Extrinsic rewards are those provided outside, external to the student, and these might be provided by the professional's management. It could be provided to them by family or some other external source. And that could be things like money or compensation. It could be things like acknowledgement and awards. And so intrinsic versus extrinsic. When we talk about those two, intrinsic motivation and intrinsic rewards are more powerful than extrinsic to many people. There are some cultures where extrinsic rewards may be very strong and highly motivating, and then there are other cultures where internal rewards or intrinsic motivation may be more powerful. It does help if you understand your culture and the culture of the student when you design training and you try to tap into the right reward mechanisms for students. So with all those conditions met, then you have an opportunity to use behavioral changes to see how somebody has begun to make use of their training and their learning. You as the trainer have to decide how to measure this, and that calls forth understanding some more of the drivers behind behaviors. So you have to have some systems in place that reinforce behavior change, that monitor behavior change, that encourage behavior change, and that reward the performances that are critical on the job. So take some time, pause, and study this chart a little bit. What we have here are several different techniques that relate to some of the tools that relate to some of the techniques and overall methods that help reinforce behavioral change. So for example, if somebody needs help reinforcing their learning, they can use checklists or other types of job aids. If somebody needs more encouragement to change their behavior, that can come from coaching or mentoring. And if people need more accountability, that might come from something like self-monitoring or some sort of dashboard or other work review. So take some time to study these. If you don't understand some of these tools or terms, then look around online and dig a little deeper after this course, and you'll be able to find plenty of examples of these. So some of the decisions for evaluating behavior and transfer are when, how often, and how do you actually do it. It's important that you let behavior be addressed or to assess behavior sometime after the training so that people have an opportunity to actually apply it. And as for how do you assess it, well, there are many ways, and you might recall that we talked about all of these different ways in class. We came up with positives and negatives. So I'll show you those next. In groups, well, we talked about each one individually. Some of the positives and negatives of using a control group are here on the screen. The control group concept is good because it allows you to have high confidence in the outcomes, but it also is very costly. And it is also very complicated, so it's easy to make mistakes. If you don't allow enough time for change to occur, then you might have some false readings, some false feedbacks. You might have not enough time for people to actually apply or change their behavior, apply their learning so that they can change their behavior. On the other hand, if you're short on time, then you have an opportunity to correct some of the mistakes and have an intervention. Evaluation of before and after. We've talked about this a lot throughout the semester. You can pause the video to read through these positives and negatives. And the same thing with surveys versus interviews and observations. And lastly, getting 100% response rate versus sampling. Having 100% responses increases your confidence in the data, but it also takes time. And sampling, while it involves fewer people, it takes time to calculate, and there's also an opportunity for errors in the math associated with statistical sampling. Repeating evaluations as necessary. Sometimes you'll want to repeat evaluations to make sure that the learning has stuck, that the behaviors have changed in a long-term manner, and sometimes you won't want to do that. So here are some of the positives and negatives that we discovered when talking about it in class. And moving forward, you need to consider costs versus benefits. As with all parts of the evaluation process, you have to consider how much do you do, how far do you do it, how much investment are you willing to put into it. Investment of money as well as time and effort. So here were a couple of examples of measuring behavior in a university setting. We talked about collecting data at orientation, measuring attendance at the orientation as well as other required events and days. We talked about attendance at lectures and tutoring sessions, assessment of homework and submission rates in courses, and several other examples. So here's a review again of the evaluation methods appropriate for this level behavior, and you can see the other two levels as well. So there's quite substantial overlap between evaluating learning, the methods and tools for evaluating learning, and the methods and tools for evaluating behavior, with only a few exceptions. So you'll want to become familiar with this, and you probably will see some questions about this content on the final exam. So transfer takeaways or behavior takeaways. So you want to evaluate what change occurred in the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of somebody that went through the training. You want to find out how much are they using their learning and how much of their new behaviors are related specifically to the training event. So there was a homework assignment for this. If you never finished it or haven't submitted it, you'll want to do so that you can receive a portion of the points available. And that brings us to level 4, results and impact. So evaluating results is something that it depends on the context of the organization and the goals, because it's specifically a return on investment measurement. That is the extent to which the training program has produced the desired results. We've talked a lot about how results can be anything from students in traditional education settings being ready for the next grade level or the next higher level of their content, or it could be something like reducing safety accidents in an industrial setting, or it can be increasing sales in a sales environment. So there could be many, many types of goals, and so the extent to which a training program leads to higher return on investment is what we're looking for when we measure results or impact. So within education, we might talk about specific student outcomes that are measurable and objective, like the pass rates or the GPAs or the student retention from year 1 to year 2, or more soft outcomes, more subjective outcomes like student satisfaction. Perhaps we want to measure student satisfaction and only 80% of students are satisfied, but we desire a 90% or higher student satisfaction rate. Satisfaction itself might be subjective on the part of the student, but measuring it and managing the satisfaction rate itself gives us a mechanism that we can use to focus on. So some of the leading indicators of results can be discovered through short-term observations. They are measurements that suggest that the behaviors are happening that will lead to the results the organization wants. And so when we talk about designing training, we say the end is the beginning. So you start with the desired results and you convert that back into appropriate critical behaviors that will lead to the desired results. After you know those behaviors, then you can start to design learning activities that will contribute to or create those behaviors. And so that's part of how this is all connected, one level to another. So here were some of the leading indicators we came up with for the program that you're in. Assignments and test grades, attendance and tardiness, participation rates, and then some of the prior statistics at the very beginning of the program, enrollment and admission statistics. How many applicants were there? What was the application yield? And on the graduation side, employment outcomes. These are all indicators of MIT success. So we might look at any of these as a result that we want to get, or we might look at these as an overall indicator or a set of indicators about the health of the MIT program. Some of the things you can look at for outcomes or results might be training that leads to saving costs or that increases efficiency and output, or to improve the quality of work. This evaluation model works in industrial settings as well as service industries as well as traditional education environments. So a few other examples of results that we've seen in those photos are listed here. Was there a social improvement, social condition that improved? Did an individual create an impact on the community, etc.? The key thing to do is to continue gathering evidence that shows the training shows what impact the training itself has had. And when you go into results, sometimes it's hard to disentangle the amount of change that happened specifically because of training and the amount of change that might have occurred for other reasons. And we recognize that that can be a challenge. Still, though, if you have built a chain of evidence as you've moved through the 4 levels of evaluation, then you start to see what the linkages are between the training and the behaviors and the results. And so you're able to make a more compelling argument that the training itself has had an impact on the results. So this wraps up the 4-level chart showing the different types of evaluation methods. And again, if you look at the far right-hand column, the results are measured in many of the same ways as other levels of evaluation. And the new one that's been added here is key business or human resources metrics. So the key business metrics, we talked about accidents or sales, those are key business metrics right there. And they would not be mixed up with any of these others. So that's where you get into something that is not an evaluation, not a learning tool, but it is a statistic that you're measuring whether or not you do any training or learning activities. So we're almost done with this review, and you might recall that there was one other homework assignment. That was to type up something about evaluation of results using this prompt. And with that, we're going to wrap up the review videos for the final exam.